This is a CBS News special report. I'm Robert Costa in Washington. We're coming on the air tonight with breaking news in Georgia's investigation into alleged interference in the 2020 presidential election. CBS News has learned that a Fulton County grand jury has voted to indict Donald Trump for his alleged efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss to then-President-elect Joe Biden. This is the fourth criminal indictment of the former president in less than 5 months. And like his third indictment issued in Washington, tonight's indictment is for alleged crimes committed while Trump was still in office. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office began this investigation following the release of that infamous phone call in which then-President Trump asked Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to, quote, find 11,780 votes. Earlier this evening, we saw a court official deliver this indictment on camera to the presiding judge. The judge reviewed the documents, returning them to the clerk. CBS News correspondent Nicole Killian is outside the courthouse in Atlanta, and joining me on set is Jeff Pegues, who covers the Justice Department and National Affairs for us. We'll go to Nicole in a moment, but Jeff, let's begin with you. There are 41 counts in this indictment in Fulton County, Georgia, 13 of them against former President Donald Trump. They are issued under what's called RICO-style prosecution, racketeering. For those of us who are not familiar with a racketeering RICO prosecution, what does this mean for Fani Willis, the district attorney, to choose this path ahead?
Well, this is a massive case, but she has experience bringing these types of RICO cases. RICO, by the way, stands for Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. I'm looking at it because typically when we talk about RICO cases, that's what we say, RICO. And what it means is that this is a massive alleged criminal enterprise. It's the kind of charge that prosecutors have used to take on mobsters, gangs, to break up these organizations. And so what they do is they bring all of these alleged criminal activities into one big case. And in this case, as it relates to former President Donald Trump, what they're saying is, even though he may not have been on the ground committing some of these alleged crimes, he was at the top of the chain.
And speaking of the top of the chain, we have Ricky Kleeman, a veteran legal analyst and lawyer, with us. Ricky, when we are looking over this indictment tonight, issued so late, now with the clerk down in Fulton County, Georgia, there are some very familiar names under this RICO prosecution. Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff, Rudy Giuliani, who was working closely with Trump in those final days of his administration. And other names we've heard a bit about over the past few years, like Ken Chesebro, the lawyer who authored a memo that talked about pushing people in Georgia and elsewhere to become so-called alternate electors, fake electors. And this is all about an effort that was put into motion allegedly by Trump and Giuliani, a pressure campaign to get people in different states to buy into their plan to overturn the election. This was not just playing out in Georgia, though that was a center battleground for this entire alleged conspiracy. So Ricky Kleeman on the phone with us tonight. When you look at this indictment, a RICO indictment, what do you see as a lawyer?
Well, I think one of the things that stands out is that the RICO indictment, which is, as Jeff so eloquently put it, really looking at racketeering influenced and corrupt organizations, what we look at is when it started and when it stopped, and who is a member of this so-called enterprise. It started, according to the indictment, on the 4th day of November 2020. That is the day after the election. So if it starts there, what we're going to learn is that the government says that Rudy Giuliani, as another co-defendant who is involved in this racketeering enterprise, is talking with Donald Trump and getting the both of them to say that they can really protest this election result and overturn the result. The enterprise goes all the way to the 15th day of September in 2022. And what the government has to prove, Bob, is it has to prove out of all of these crimes that are alleged here, all of these counts, that only 2, it doesn't have to prove 41 counts. It doesn't have to prove Donald Trump's alleged counts, all of them. It just has to prove 2, that 2 of these acts were part of the racketeering enterprise within a very short period of time, usually 2 years. Here you have a 2-year spread. So it is not a difficult situation for the prosecution to get to beyond a reasonable doubt on 2. Maybe on all of them, yes. Maybe on all of the defendants, yes. But when you're looking for 2 and you've got this many defendants, 18 co-defendants here, the government has broadened its chances of success.
Ricky Kleeman, thank you so much. Stay with us. What you're looking at on screen is a copy of the counts that are being laid out, the people who have been indicted tonight in Fulton County, Georgia. You see at the top the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. Below, Rudy Giuliani, the lawyer for Trump in the final days, trying to push people in Georgia, based on our reporting, to buy into Trump's alleged conspiracy to overturn the election. The third name there is very important. You see John Charles Eastman. John Eastman's a conservative lawyer from California who authored a memo that was actually discovered by Bob Woodward and I when we were reporting on January 6th. And this was a 2-page memo that many have called a blueprint for a coup. And like that Chesborough memo I mentioned a few minutes ago, Eastman's memo also articulated a plan for having people organize as alternate electors in states like Georgia, so that when the election was, even after it was certified by the Electoral College in December 2020, Eastman and others wanted Congress to throw out the votes and have new electors come in from different states so Trump could stay in power. That was ultimately the plan. Mark Meadows, such an important person in this story. He was involved, based on this indictment, in pressuring people in Georgia again and again, working with Trump, who was on the phone with Brad Raffensperger, the election official in Georgia, to try to get something happening, moving in Georgia. Meadows was part of alleged efforts to push the governor, Brian Kemp, to have a special session in Georgia that would make Trump the victor in Georgia, not Biden. Below Meadows' name, you see Ken Chesborough, who authored the memo on the alternate electors. Then you start to see some different names that don't seem that familiar if you don't follow the legal community, but Jeff Clark and Jenna Ellis, a Trump lawyer, Michael Roman, a Trump campaign lawyer. These were many people, and then some of the other names here are those in Georgia who were involved in trying to help Trump. And near the bottom, you also see Sidney Powell. You've heard her name in many stories at CBS News. She was someone who was pushing Trump to seize voting machines and take control of the voting machines in the country. She was focused intently on Georgia in the final days of the administration. We're also joined by Don Samuels, who is a veteran criminal lawyer. He's with us here on the program. Don, thanks for being with us, if you can hear us.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can hear you fine.
Don, what's your assessment of this indictment?
This is a massive indictment. This is the type of indictment that we were probably expecting from Jack Smith in the federal case in D.C. As you were just reporting, the number of defendants alleged to be part of this RICO enterprise, which has, a lot of its core right here in Georgia, from Trump right down to, Giuliani and Mark Meadows and Sidney Powell, a lot of local people involved in this. The allegations is that this enterprise, this organization, engaged in a pattern of illegal activity, including not just the activity in Georgia, but trying to convince Raffensperger to change the vote, but also threatening the Fulton County election workers. We've heard about that. The allegations in this indictment also include trying to solicit the vice president of the United States to change the vote, to change the certification, trying to solicit members of the Attorney General's office to engage in criminal acts. It's everything that we learned or watched about during the January 6th congressional hearings, finds its way into this indictment. It's a massive indictment with many, many defendants involved in many different, alleged to be involved in many different crimes over the course of, the several months between the election and the eventual certification.
Don, stick with us. We appreciate your analysis. We are waiting for the district attorney in Fulton County, District Attorney Willis, to make remarks about this indictment in the coming minutes. But before she begins her news conference, let's go to our Trenton correspondent in Atlanta, CBS News correspondent Nicole Killian, who is outside the courthouse in Atlanta. Nicole, you've been reading over this indictment. You've been talking to sources all day and really all year about this investigation. What's top of mind for you in your reporting and in your reading?
Well, in terms of these racketeering charges, these are charges that we potentially expected for a number of reasons. One, because the district attorney has used them before in major sprawling cases, and this, of course, is notably one. But also because of the gravity of this case and the number of individuals who have been involved. I mean, we have some 18 individuals charged in addition to the former president. Using these types of racketeering charges really allows the district attorney the opportunity to almost use it as an umbrella charge to link these various individuals together, which is why there is the terminology that is used in this indictment and enterprise, because that could be individuals who do associate with each other. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's drug related. In this case, it is more politically related. And so in laying out some of the manners and methods of this enterprise, what this indictment details is the various steps that the former president and some of his top allies took to try to allegedly overturn the 2020 election, beginning with, for instance, false statements to and solicitation of state legislatures. We know that there were several hearings that were held at the state capitol back in December of 2020, where you had Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani, who was named in this indictment, who tried to convince state lawmakers to try to put up their own slate of electors and not to certify the results of the election. I spoke with one former state lawmaker who actually testified before the grand jury today, who told me that even then, as she was sitting in that hearing, and she is a Democratic lawmaker, mind you, that, she thought that these claims were ridiculous that Rudy Giuliani was making, and ultimately many of them were disproven in terms of illegal ballots and ballots stored in suitcases and the like. But this indictment really details those types of steps, this pressure campaign against state officials. As you mentioned, Governor Kemp, who appeared before the special purpose grand jury many months ago. We also had former Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, who appeared before the grand jury today, who presided over the state Senate at the time. So there was this pressure campaign, according to this indictment, against some state officials. That this went on beyond that in terms of trying to come up with this slate of false electors. We know some of the witnesses who testified today actually witnessed one of those meetings in progress. So the indictment references this. And then just going beyond that, when you have these racketeering charges, basically what it lays out are some of these predicate or overt acts that have led to these charges. And so we can see in the indictment that one of the initial overt acts, if you will, was on November 4th of 2020, when this indictment says that the former president, in a nationally televised speech, falsely declared election victory. So that is just, what we've been able to glean thus far from reading through this indictment. Again, we are looking at some 41 charges, 13 of those against the former president tonight.
Nicole, terrific reporting. Please stay with us. We're still waiting for District Attorney Fani Willis to make remarks about this indictment tonight in Fulton County, Georgia. And tonight, the Trump campaign lashed out at the Fulton County District Attorney in a statement saying, quote, Democrat District Attorney Fani Willis is a rabid partisan who is campaigning and fundraising on a platform of prosecuting President Trump through these bogus indictments, end quote. David Becker is with us. He is CBS News' election expert. He also co-wrote The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. David, thanks for being with us here tonight. How would you break down this indictment?
Thanks, Robert. I think there are three kind of buckets of charges that are being alleged here. One is the fake electors scheme, the effort to create these false slates of electors that were delivered to the National Archives, recruiting those members to sign those documents. Second is the attempt to seize and potentially breach voting machines. This is an effort, particularly in Coffee County, Georgia. There's an individual in the indictment, Kathleen Latham, who's mentioned there, who was involved with that. And then lastly, kind of broadly, the attempt to pressure and threaten elected officials, the legislators, the governor, and then most notably Secretary of State Raffensperger. These are the kind of three buckets of claims. And we have to recognize also that while these schemes were all going on, there were efforts in the courts to challenge the election results and bring evidence that allegedly would show that there were problems, and every one of those failed. There was even a Trump-appointed judge, Judge Grimberg, who heard claims in Georgia and found that there was no merit to them whatsoever. And this was ongoing well past the time when those claims were being reviewed by courts. So we're still sitting here over 1,000 days after the November 2020 election, and there has still not been a shred of evidence shown to any court anywhere in the country, including in Georgia, that would back up any of those claims. So I think that's really kind of the context in which we're looking at all of this.
Speaking of context, I want to come back to Nicole Killian as we wait for the district attorney to speak. Nicole, for people just tuning in, it's 11:16 p.m. on the East Coast in Atlanta, Georgia, Fulton County. Why is this happening late night, at least on the East Coast? Why is the district attorney waiting this long to speak on Monday evening? Take us through the day as you can through your reporting about how we ended up here tonight in this position.
Yeah, well, it is an unusual time. It's not usually that we would have a court proceeding and have an indictment returned at almost midnight, but yet here we are, and it is in part because this has been a day full of a lot of activity here at the Fulton County Courthouse. We knew that the district attorney was set to present her case to the grand jury today, which she ultimately did. That grand jury heard from a series of witnesses, and things started moving faster than expected. We were expecting some witnesses, for instance, to testify before the grand jury tomorrow.
As you can through your reporting about how we ended up here tonight in this position.
Yeah, well, it is an unusual time. It's not usually that we would have a court proceeding and have an indictment returned at almost midnight, but yet here we are, and it is in part because this has been a day full of a lot of activity here at the Fulton County Courthouse. We knew that the district attorney was set to present her case to the grand jury today, which she ultimately did. That grand jury heard from a series of witnesses, and things started moving faster than expected. We were expecting some witnesses, for instance, to testify before the grand jury tomorrow. Instead, they got pushed up to today, late this afternoon, and by early evening, it appeared that they were starting to wrap up and that the grand jury was voting, and we started to see more activity with sheriff's deputies moving up to certain floors of the courthouse, specifically outside of the courtroom where ultimately this indictment was unsealed. And in terms of why we are here at this hour, I think in part the district attorney has been clear that she sees it as her duty to follow the law. If somebody broke the law here in Fulton County, it's her duty to prosecute. But keep in mind, there have been a lot of concerns here with respect to her own safety and security. She has received a number of threats and has only talked publicly about a sliver of some of the threats that she has received. So some of this could potentially be around the issue of security. Of course, you have less foot traffic here around the courthouse at 11 o'clock at night Eastern time. But also, because this indictment has since been returned, it only makes sense that she would address it and talk about it in more detail, and her team making the decision that she will do this tonight.
Jeff Bezos, when you look at this indictment, you've been reading over it the last few minutes, as someone who covers the Justice Department, which is also investigating January 6th with its own special counsel investigation, how does this fit in the bigger picture? Help us understand.
It really is interesting to see the contrast between the federal cases and now this local case in Fulton County, Georgia. For example, if you look at the Fulton County, Georgia case, you have some of these, many, frankly, of these alleged crimes caught on camera or audio tape with that phone call. Can you find 11,780 votes? You know, this is the kind of evidence that prosecutors drool over because these were public statements. Rudy Giuliani made a lot of false claims publicly in press conferences. So really all you have to do is show that video to potential jurors and see how they receive it. But I'm sure the prosecutor has a pretty confident view of the case that they have. It's taken 2.5 years. We thought that this is a case that may have gone first in terms of a potential indictment earlier this year, but it's dragged out this long. They've interviewed a lot of potential witnesses, a lot of people who received target letters, and that's what you're seeing in this pretty massive case.
Jeff, could this Georgia case complicate the special counsel investigation on January 6th in terms of timing and legal deadlines?
It could. It could. You have 4 indictments of this former president now, and so at some point, this will all come to a head in terms of the courtroom. They're going to have to take these cases to court. Every single one of these prosecutors will have to set court dates. And then you have the political calendar at play as well.
So we are still waiting for the district attorney in Fulton County, Fani Willis, to address the 41-count indictment, 13 against former President Donald Trump. She is going to make remarks late tonight in just a few minutes. We're waiting to see what she has to say about the details of this indictment. But Don Samuel, as a veteran lawyer who's been around prosecutors for years, understands the kind of pressure she might be under. What are you waiting to hear from the district attorney after reading and reviewing this indictment? What does she need to say, or what do you expect her to say at this moment, a crucial moment?
I think she is. She's going to be very measured in her comments. I would assume she is a incredibly intelligent district attorney. She was the ADA for many, many years, and now is the district attorney, of course. The breadth of this indictment, just reading through it, a lot of it involves acts in Michigan, Pennsylvania, in Washington, D.C., in Wisconsin. I mean, the amount of work that went into just, drafting this indictment is really breathtaking. And the scope of what now is confronting her that she needs to present at some point at trial is really remarkable. It's most unusual for a state prosecutor to say, I'm going to prosecute all these events that occurred all over the country, over the course of an extended period of time with, more than a dozen and a half people. As I said, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, all involved in this concerted activity, allegedly, to change the vote, to alter the vote, to convince people to commit crimes, to engage in soliciting people and conspiring with people, to create false documents, to make false representations to the state Senate in Georgia, to threaten some of the election workers here in Fulton County. I mean, this is a case that if everybody were to go to trial and the cases, weren't severed, this is a case that would last a year, just to try the case. And it's really a remarkable undertaking.
Thank you, Don. Stick with us. CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman joins us again on the phone. Ricky, so often in the past as a reporter, when I hear RICO, it's usually in the context of an investigation of the mafia, a sprawling criminal enterprise being pursued in a collective way. What are the challenges for the district attorney in Fulton County to have all of these people named as part of a RICO indictment?
Well, challenges indeed. If you thought it took a long time to get to this point, just wait to see how long it takes to get this case to trial and to try it. Well, you have to arraign each of these defendants. We're going to start with that. They're not going to all come in on the same day and be arraigned along with Donald Trump. There's going to be a series of rolling arraignments. Then every defendant gets to file motions and argue motions. Every defendant gets to have his or her lawyer go forward to question prospective jurors. And when Don Samuel is one of the great lawyers in America, Don Samuel and I have tried these kinds of cases. You try having a case with 19 defendants and a witness gets up on the stand and has to be cross-examined. When Don says this trial could take a year, he is absolutely correct. And heaven knows how long it will take before that year to get the case to trial. If there's any case that's going to wind up going last, it's going to be this one.
Thank you, Ricky Kleeman, as ever, so on the mark. When you think about Georgia, as someone who's covered this story of election 2020 for a long time, it's important to step back and think about why Georgia matters. Georgia matters in the broader story of January 6 and former President Donald Trump because it became a target for Trump and his allies post-election 2020. They were looking for some way to stay in power, and they saw many states out there where the margins, in their view, were relatively slim and could potentially be overturned if Trump could get enough people to help him out. But Georgia, because it's a ruby red state, became a focus for Trump and Giuliani as they thought about how could they make this happen? How could they put into motion something that would keep Trump in power? And they thought about getting buy-in. They needed buy-in from the legislature. So they went to lawmakers in Georgia and they said, we need your help. They went to election officials, sometimes on the phone, like Brad Raffensperger, and said, help us, give us the cover of your word to say that this election was not legitimate in Georgia. They pressured the governor. And this was about Trump trying to get Congress ultimately to have a contingent election based on all this activity in the states. So Georgia's important because it's a microcosm for what has happened in American democracy over the last few years. Georgia was a cauldron of this activity at the official level, the legislative level, the executive level, ultimately back in Washington with Georgia lawmakers being told to try to buy into Trump's plan. And David Becker has done a lot of work on this as well and has been really looking at Georgia. And I think, David, you can help us understand that while Trump and others were pressuring Georgia officials to do something, anything, to help him out, the alleged fraud never came to the fore because it didn't exist in the view of those who were assessing the elections in Georgia. Remind us of what happened in Georgia in terms of certifying the election and looking into fraud.
Yeah, let's take a look at Georgia in 2020. It was using paper ballots throughout the state for the first time in 2 decades. The 2016 election was largely voted on in Georgia with purely digital ballots, which couldn't be recounted or audited in any way. And yet in 2020, thanks to the leadership of the Republican majority legislature and Republicans in the state at the executive level, like Secretary of State Raffensperger, they moved to a paper ballot system. And so everyone in Georgia in 2020 voted on paper ballots. And those ballots, as we know, could be audited and recounted. And in fact, they were counted at the presidential level 3 times, 3 different ways. Once with machines at the local level, once with larger central counted machines at former President Trump's request. And lastly, once entirely by hand, over 5 million ballots counted entirely by hand, thanks to the diligence of election officials throughout the state in about 5 days. That was all done before the electoral count. The electoral votes were certified and sent to the National Archives on December 14th. This was while litigation was ongoing, but we had absolute verification, even when claims came out about the suitcase of ballots in Fulton County, which ended up just being a normal box of ballots that was being reviewed by election officials. While there was claims of 10,000 dead voters who had voted, election officials in Georgia at the state and local level investigated all of those claims and found that there were only actually 4. And those were 4 people who had died recently, right before the election, and their spouses returned ballots in those cases. So the widespread fraud, we could confirm it didn't happen in Georgia thanks to the work of the election officials in the states. And that's why every court who looked at this found that there was no evidence of fraud, and why Republicans, Governor Kemp, Secretary Raffensperger, Republicans throughout the state certified the results and sent them to Congress.
David Becker, thank you. We are still waiting for District Attorney Fani Willis in Fulton County, Georgia, to address reporters late at night here following this indictment of former President Trump and many of his associates in Washington at the time and in Georgia. Nicole Killian is on the ground for us at the courthouse in Fulton County in Atlanta, Georgia. Nicole, there are so many instances and episodes that are detailed in this indictment that we've heard about before in the federal investigation. For example, on page 61 of this indictment, it talks about January 5th, 2021, and John Eastman, that conservative lawyer, pressuring then Vice President Mike Pence's attorney and his advisors to have Pence overturn the election. What's the challenge, though, in the difference with a state case versus a federal case when it comes to these episodes?
Well, I think it's also remarkable to note, as we discussed a little earlier, some of these overt acts that are used to lay out specifically these racketeering charges. We're talking about 161 overt acts that make up this racketeering charge. That is huge. That is huge. And that details from, again, in the days right after the election up until last fall. And so that is, I think, very important to note. But when we look at state charges versus federal charges, perhaps one of the most notable differences is the power of the president himself. As we know, former President Trump is running for re-election in 2024 if he were victorious. And if he is convicted and charged here in Fulton County, unlike federal charges, he would not have the ability to pardon himself. So, there is likely the possibility that if he were victorious, he could potentially be on trial as a sitting president, but he really wouldn't be able to do anything about those charges. Again, contrary to these federal charges, which if he is reelected, he could potentially, again, pardon himself and dismiss them. And so that is perhaps the biggest difference here. But again, I think given how sprawling these charges are, not just involving the former president, but his allies as well, as Ricky mentioned, this is something that is going to take a lot of time to work through. We have seen in other instances where the former president and his legal team have tried to push back court proceedings and trial dates. So one wonders what type of strategy the former president and his legal team will employ here, simply because there is a lot to move through in this case.
And as you mentioned, Nicole, this is all playing in Georgia amid a presidential campaign where Trump is seeking the Republican nomination. And one of the key witnesses in the federal case is also mentioned here, former Vice President Mike Pence. But, Jeff, when you look at what's happening tonight in Georgia, you see that this is one of 4 ongoing cases against former President Trump. There's one in New York about hush money payments he made ahead of the 2016 election. There's another on classified records, another on January 6th from the special counsel, and now an indictment in Georgia. Where does this fit among those 4?
Think about it this way, and we haven't talked about it. But the penalties in a case like this, if you're convicted, could go up to 20 years behind bars. These are serious cases. And then you add the other cases and the legal jeopardy that the former president faces there. This is serious stuff. And I've said this before, that anybody else in America facing this much legal jeopardy would be extremely concerned. I mean, look at this case. We're talking about Mark Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, 2 people in the past who've come out and made statements. They like press conferences. We haven't heard from them recently because I think the weight of this case should make anybody involved or caught up in it think twice about making public statements because you could further jeopardize your legal standing.
Jeff, when Trump allies talk about what's going on in Georgia, they talk about the January 6th case, they repeatedly say that Trump and his allies were having free speech, that they're able to criticize the election, that they're able to make these claims of fraud, even if it's not based on any fact. How is that free speech argument potentially going to play? And then we'll come to Don about that.
It depends on who you talk to. Defense attorneys might see that as a valid defense, but if you get into a courtroom and a prosecutor, especially as it relates to this case, shows video of that phone call from then President Trump to Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, you cannot pressure a public official to change an election. Certainly not in this democracy. And so anybody who's seen that tape, who rolls in legal circles, knows that that is just not the kind of thing that you want documented in any way.
Don Samuel, when you think about the Trump arguments that we are going to see in motions to come, in arguments in the courtroom, what do you believe is going to unfold from the Trump side as a legal argument, and how might it play in Georgia?
Well, I think that he is, I'm not going to defend him or offer his defense, but obviously he's going to be relying to some extent on advice of counsel. There are a number of lawyers listed in the indictment. Many lawyers in the indictment are indicted. And so he probably will claim that he was getting advice from those lawyers, which is a defense to many of the charges. I think a lot of his speeches and a lot of his self-advocacy would be protected by the First Amendment. There's a lot that he's entitled to, he's allowed to speak his piece. He's allowed to make claims that the voting in Georgia and Fulton County was beset with a number of problems. There's no doubt there was lots of problems with the voting in Fulton County, not fraud. Nobody's found any fraud, but there have been instances in which there were findings made that ballots were lost and ballots were miscounted. So that's going to be his defense. The problem, of course, is it's just an overwhelming amount of false statements that are being made. False statements being made by other people who are encouraged to make false statements. The First Amendment doesn't protect perjury. It doesn't allow you to testify falsely. It doesn't allow you to go make speeches at the state Senate and advocate for that the state senators do something which is illegal. It's not, the First Amendment doesn't protect the right of someone to go to the vice president, tell him to violate the Constitution, or to advocate for public officials in Georgia to violate their oath of office, to uphold the Constitution. So, the First Amendment is going to be a defense, and the advice of counsel is going to be the defense. And the question is, how much of it, will a jury in Fulton County, if it ends up in Fulton County, if there's no change of venue, will they believe that in fact he was acting in good faith, or is that just the breadth of the information going to defy that?
Don, it looks like Fani Willis, the district attorney, is now approaching the lectern. Here she is, District Attorney Fani Willis of Fulton County, Georgia.
Thank you for joining us. I'm here with the prosecutors and investigators who have worked diligently on the investigation of criminal attempts to interfere in the administration of Georgia's 2020 presidential election. Today, based on information developed by that investigation, a Fulton County grand jury returned a true bill of indictment, charging 19 individuals with violations of Georgia law arising from a criminal conspiracy to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in this state. The indictment includes 41 felony counts and is 97 pages long. Please remember that everyone charged in this bill of indictment is presumed innocent. Specifically, the indictment brings felony charges against Donald John Trump, Rudolph William Louis Giuliani, John Charles Eastman, Mark Randall Meadows, John Cheeseborough, Jeffrey Clark, Jenna Lynn Ellis, Ray Stallings Smith III, Robert David Cheeley, Michael A. Roman, David James Schaefer, Sean Micah Tresher Steele, Stephen Cliffgard Lee, Harrison William Prescott Floyd, Travion C. Cootie, Sydney Catherine Powell, Kathleen Austin Latham, Scott Graham Hall, and Misty Hampton, also known as Emily Misty Hayes. Every individual charged in the indictment is charged with one count of violating Georgia's Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act through participation in a criminal enterprise in Fulton County, Georgia, and elsewhere to accomplish the illegal goal of allowing Donald J. Trump to seize the presidential term of office beginning on January 20th, 21. Specifically, the participants in association took various actions in Georgia and elsewhere to block the counting of the votes of the presidential electors who were certified as the winners of Georgia's 2020 general election. As you examine the indictment, you will see acts that are identified as overt acts and those that are identified as predicate acts, sometimes called acts of racketeering activity. Overt acts are not necessarily crimes under Georgia law in isolation, but are alleged to be acts taken in furtherance of the conspiracy. Many occurred in Georgia, and some occurred in other jurisdictions and are included because the grand jury believes they were part of the illegal effort to overturn the results of Georgia's 2020 presidential election. The acts identified as predicate acts or acts of racketeering activity are crimes that are alleged to have been committed in furtherance of the criminal enterprise. Acts of racketeering activity are also charged as separate counts in the indictment against those who are alleged to have committed them. All elections in our nation are administered by these states, which are given the responsibility of ensuring a fair process and an accurate counting of the votes. That includes elections for presidential electors, Congress, state officials, and local offices. The state's role in this process is essential to the functioning of our democracy. Georgia, like every state, has laws that allow those who believe that results of an election are wrong, whether because of intentional wrongdoing or unintentional error, to challenge those results in our state courts. The indictment alleges that rather than abide by Georgia's legal process for election challenges, the defendants engaged in a criminal racketeering enterprise to overturn Georgia's presidential election result. Subsequent to the indictment, as is the normal process in Georgia law, the grand jury issued arrest warrants for those who are charged. I am giving the defendants the opportunity to voluntarily surrender no later than noon on Friday, the 25th day of August, 2023. I remind everyone here that an indictment is only a series of allegations based on a grand jury's determination of probable cause to support the charges. It is now the duty of my office to prove these charges in the indictment beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. I would like to take a moment to thank the Superior Court Clerk, Shay Alexander, and her staff for staying late and making sure that this indictment was processed. I would also like to thank the men and women of Sheriff Labatt's office for keeping the courthouse open, but most importantly for keeping us safe over the weeks and months that have led up to this indictment, and for what I know they will continue to do to keep us safe. We also want to thank the Atlanta Police Department and other law enforcement partners who have worked with the sheriff to keep us safe. I will now take a very limited number of questions prior to going to sleep.
Are If you don't mind, Savannah Levins with 11 Alive. Quick question. Can you clarify in Georgia the mandatory minimum when it comes to RICO charges, whether it's servable by probation or how that might play out?
The RICO charges has time that you have to serve, so it is not a probated sentence.
Madam District Attorney, what's the timetable for your trial?
What is the timetable for the trial?
Yes.
As you know, in this jurisdiction, trials are set by the judges, and so it will be the judge that sets the date of the trial. This office will be submitting a proposed scheduling order within this week. However, that will totally be at the discretion of the judge.
You're the fourth person, the fourth jurisdiction now to indict Donald Trump. Do you believe you need to be the fourth one to try him, or could you move it up? Do you want to be the first to try him?
I don't have any desire to be first or last. I want to try him and be respectful for our sovereign states. We do want to move this case along, and so we will be asking for a proposed order that occurs a trial date within the next 6 months.
Have you had any contact? Earlier today, there was a fictitious document, according to the Fulton County Clerk's Office, that was circulated online with charges against former President Donald Trump. That fictitious document matched exactly the charges that we now see in this indictment. Can you tell us more about that document leak? Because now you have the former president's lawyers who are saying that this is emblematic of a serious problem with your office.
No, I can't tell you anything about what you refer to. What I can tell you is that we had a grand jury here in Fulton County. They deliberated till almost 8 o'clock, if not right after 8 o'clock. An indictment was returned. It was true billed, and you now have an indictment. I am not an expert on clerks' duties or even administrative duties. I wouldn't know how to work that system, and so I'm not going to speculate. Next question.
Willis, have you had any contact with the special counsel about overlap between these cases, and do you intend to try all of these defendants together?
Do I intend to try the 19 defendants in this indictment together? Yes.
And have you had any contact with the special counsel about the overlap between this indictment and the federal indictment?
I'm not going to discuss our investigation at this time.
Have there been any conversations?
The arguments made by former President Trump that this is a politically motivated indictment.
I make decisions in this office based on the facts and the law. The law is completely nonpartisan. That's how decisions are made in every case. To date, this office has indicted, since I've been sitting as the district attorney, over 12,000 cases. This is the 11th RICO indictment. We followed the same process. We look at the facts, we look at the law, and we bring charges.
Have there been conversations about the terms of surrender?
Will you try this case yourself, Ms. Willis?
Has the jury been cleared?
Get down.
Willis of Fulton County, Georgia, speaking to reporters just days after former President Donald Trump was indicted by the special counsel in Washington on the federal level for an alleged conspiracy to defraud the United States. The former president, also the Republican frontrunner in the 2024 primary race, now faces charges in Georgia, in Fulton County, for alleged racketeering. Alongside the federal case, it's very similar in scope, about an alleged conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election. So now in the United States, two cases playing out simultaneously, one on the state level in Georgia, one on the federal level. Nicole Killian is outside the courthouse in Fulton County. Nicole, your report on what the district attorney had to say.
Well, notable again that she outlined 41 felony charges against the former president and 18 other defendants, many of whom are the former president's top allies and aides. And she said that every individual is charged with one count of RICO, or these racketeering charges we've been discussed, through their participation in criminal enterprise to allow the former president to seize the term of office back in 2020. Now, in that Q&A, she did talk about wanting to move this trial along. She said she didn't necessarily want to be first or last, but when appropriate. And furthermore, what was most significant is that she said that all of these defendants have until Friday, August 25th at noon to voluntarily surrender. Otherwise, a warrant could be issued for their arrest. So that is kind of the next process, the step forward. She said that they would put a scheduling order forth to the judge. Obviously, it's up to a judge, as she mentioned, to determine when a potential trial could be scheduled. But it was also notable that she said that she does intend to try all of these individuals together.
Nicole, thank you very much for your excellent reporting. Jeff Pegues covers the Justice Department here with me at the table. Looking over this indictment on page 57, for example, it talks about an episode in the Oval Office on January 4th, 2021, where John Eastman told Pence in front of Trump to try to overturn the election, to buy into Eastman's plan. This has been a crucial part of the January 6th investigation on Capitol Hill, now with the special counsel, and now you see it in this indictment in Georgia. What does that mean to have something that happened in Washington in the Oval Office part of a state indictment? And is that part of how you see the racketeering charge here?
Yeah, it's part of what prosecutors believe in this case is this vast criminal enterprise. We talked earlier about how RICO charges are used in mob and gangland cases. Typically, in some of those cases, you'll use wiretaps. Investigators will use wiretaps to gather information. But in this case, they have some audio recordings, as I said before, but also they have some of these conversations captured in witness statements, perhaps, to the grand jury. So they have information that we have not heard thus far from some of these charges that the special counsel has brought. And so I find that fascinating about this case. She talks about it being more than just about what happened in Georgia, but also in other states across the country and in Washington, D.C.
Don Samuel, a veteran criminal lawyer with us. Don, you listened closely to what District Attorney Willis had to say. As a lawyer, as someone who knows the courtroom, knows this world, what was your interpretation in view of what she had to say tonight?
Well, I think it was a little unrealistic to think that a case like this could go to trial in 6 months. It's really a virtual impossibility to have 19 defendants prepared to go to trial in 6 months in a case of this size, unless there's going to be, a tsunami of guilty pleas from a number of the defendants. That's just not practical. The difficulty of finding a jury in a case like this. There's another large RICO case going on in Fulton County right now that is expected to last 18 months. 18 months. How do you find jurors who can set aside their business, their lives, to some extent be separated from family for 18 months to try this case? It's taken 9 months in that case just to find a jury. And the same thing is going to be true in this case, not only because of the length of the trial, but because of the amount of the pretrial publicity to find enough jurors who would be qualified to serve. So this case is not going to trial in 6 months. There's not a judge in Georgia who would set that kind of timetable, which is just impossible to meet. The breadth of the indictment, just some of the people are charged with conduct that occurred, as I said earlier, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, Arizona, in Washington, D.C., to say nothing of Georgia. The amount of investigation needed just by the defense for each of these defendants. It's just, this case is going to be going on, as Ricky Kleeman said before, for years before it ever gets to a trial. Unless a judge severs it and just says, we're going to do groups of 3 or 4 people at a time, in which case it could be somewhat faster.
Appreciate that, Don Samuel. Nicole Killian, we'll go back to you outside the courthouse. What's the scene like there? There was much talk about security concerns for months about this indictment in Georgia. Many Trump supporters in the state and others. What is it like there tonight? Quiet or something else?
Well, at this point, it is relatively quiet, albeit those of us here in the media who have been waiting for this indictment to be put out, and of course waiting for the district attorney to give her press conference. At this point in time, we believe the courthouse is closed. We know that the sheriff's deputies were trying to clear it a little while ago, and so really the scene is relatively calm. That being said, I would note that some of the former president's allies, most notably some who were associated with the rally that the former president had on January 6th at the Ellipse before the attack on the Capitol, have called for people to demonstrate and to show up here at the courthouse when and if the former president is arraigned. So that is something to watch, because there has been concern again about security, about threats. It is why this courthouse has been barricaded for the past 3 weeks, more or less, and why security has been very tight here, not just today, but again, over an extended period of time. So we will have to see if that gets extended beyond this week. The sheriff has previously said that he feels that his department is ready, that they are prepared to handle protesters, that they have been fielding some of these dozens of threats that the district attorney and other county officials have received, but it does remain a concern writ large here in the county.
Nicole, when former President Trump arrives in Fulton County, what's it going to be like for him inside that courthouse? Will he receive a mugshot? Will he be processed, fingerprinted, put in handcuffs? What do you expect to actually happen?
Well, the sheriff has made clear that he is going to treat the former president and any defendant, for that matter, just like anyone else, that he will follow the normal practices, as he said, and that could include a mugshot. Now, what is unclear is we don't know where exactly the former president could be processed. If it's here at the courthouse, because typically most people are processed at the Fulton County Jail, which is some distance from here. And so that is something, of course, that we will be watching for. But just like all of these indictments and these court appearances, it is likely to be a huge spectacle. We already have media, camped out, taking up the entire city block behind me. And just like in Washington, just like in Miami, just like in New York, where we saw the former president make an appearance in court, it not only draws huge media attention, but also potentially can draw protesters as well. So there is, again, a desire to keep a secure perimeter, to make sure that they can keep the courthouse functioning during that period of time. But it will be a heavy lift across the board, likely to include a number of not only local law enforcement agencies, but federal as well, as they prepare for the former president to potentially come here to Atlanta.
Thank you, Nicole Killian. Trevian Cootie is among those charged tonight. She is Kanye West's former publicist who traveled to Georgia election worker Ruby Freeman's home when she was getting death threats and tried to convince her to admit the election was stolen. Freeman was falsely accused by former President Trump and his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, of committing voter fraud during the 2020 election. And the January 6th committee, as you remember, asked her about how those accusations affected her and her personal life.
Now I won't even introduce myself by my name anymore. I get nervous when I bump into someone I know in the grocery store who says my name. I'm worried about who's listening. I get nervous when I have to give my name for food orders. I'm always concerned of who's around me. I've lost my name, and I've lost my reputation. I've lost my sense of security, all because a group of people starting.
We just heard from Ruby Freeman. Nicole Killian, this is a story that's not just about this alleged scheme. It involves many people, real people, whose lives were affected by what went on in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, that's right. And this indictment references some of the harassment that was faced by Fulton County election workers like Ruby Freeman, who you just heard from, and who we also heard from during those January 6th Select Committee hearings, with a very impassioned and emotional testimony in terms of the personal impact, the death threats that they received as a result of the former president and individuals like Rudy Giuliani uttering their name and accusing them of election fraud, which ultimately proved to be untrue. In fact, there is also litigation still pending involving Rudy Giuliani and these two Fulton County election workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. So to your point, this is a very not only sprawling case that we are dealing with right now, but part of ongoing litigation that spreads much wider and beyond.
Thank you, Nicole Killian. To recap tonight, former President Donald Trump has been indicted by a Fulton County grand jury on 13 counts related to his alleged efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss to now President Joe Biden. The charges include conspiracy and racketeering, which is often used to target members of organized crime. This is Trump's fourth criminal indictment in less than 5 months. 18 others in Trump's inner circle and orbit have also been indicted, including former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and lawyers Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman.